Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Mind of Marie. Today, I'm joined by a writer and a ritual designer whose debut book is both a reckoning and a reclamation. Bill Holzman is the author of Six to Carry the Casket and One to Say the Mass, a collection of essays that explore queer identity, Catholicism, family dynamics, and pop culture with humor, honesty, and heart. His writing invites us to reflect, to release, and to reconstruct the selves we choose to become. Bill, let me just say it's an honor to welcome you to my show today.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here.
Okay, so my first question is what stirred the impulse to write Six to Carry the Casket and One to Say the Mass? Was there a moment when you knew this story needed to be told?
I started writing the essays in the book as a way to understand how I landed in a place of burnout. As I was starting my role as a middle school principal, my mom died after a long illness just 2 days before the start of the school year. And my sister died suddenly a year later, and my dad a few months after my sister, after a long decline. So between swimming in grief and navigating this most challenging job I'd ever had, I completely burned out. But it was also around this time that I met my husband. And as we planned to merge our lives, I decided to take a year to heal, figure out what would come next. In the middle of this self-imposed sabbatical, 2020 happened. And I didn't want to understand just how I landed there. I wanted to understand how we all landed there. Early in the pandemic, a writer whom I love, Arundhati Roy, wrote an essay titled The Pandemic is a Portal. And she saw the pandemic as an opportunity to recreate the world. The worst thing, she wrote, would be a return to normal. And I really took that to heart. I didn't want to return to normal. Writing these essays was a way for me to identify the relationships and experiences that shaped me and delivered me to that moment. But it also allowed me space to discern what I wanted to let go of, what I wanted to hold on to, and the person that I wanted to be. So that was really the inspiration behind the book.
I remember saying that during the quarantine too, when people would be like, when can we go back to normal? And I was like,
Yeah.
well, the normal that we had isn't necessarily a good one either.
Yeah.
You described the book as a reckoning with inherited identity. How did you begin to question the one you were born into and start shaping the one you wanted to claim?
We often think identity is fixed. We often approach it as a fixed entity, as a fact of ourselves. It's what you inherit, it's where you land in the world. I think of it identity as different. I think of it as a tool, and I also think of it as a window. So let me explain. As a tool, it's a tool for understanding ourselves, for understanding others, for helping us navigate the world. Some tools don't work. Some tools break. We need to repair them or replace them. Likewise, the identities that we're born into, sometimes that doesn't serve us anymore. Sometimes we need to repair or replace the ones that we've been given. And we don't have an identity. We have several. We have a cultural identity. We have sexual identity. We have religious identity, gender, political, socioeconomic. But each of these identities is also a window. It frames our view of the world, but it also gives others a glimpse in. And I think that's a particularly potent metaphor for me because, sometimes we can leave a window open and invite passersby to peek in, and sometimes we close it. And it's not my right to tear open a window that somebody else has closed for me. So I think, thinking of identities a little bit more creatively is a starting point for not just owning our identities, but figuring out what we want to reshape and what we want to recreate, how we want to recreate ourselves. For me, revisiting the identities, the experiences and relationships that shaped me, helped me see the ways that I was enabled or disabled by the identities that I inherited. And the writing process really helped me claim and prioritize the identities that I really wanted to claim and put at the fore.
I can completely agree with that. It's a little bit of that you're always a work in progress. And with your identity, you're kind of like an onion of layers. So there's so many things that make up what a person is that when people project ideas onto them based on what their perception is, and that person is supposed to live up to them, it causes a disconnect.
Mm-hmm.
So I commend you for having the courage to do that. You described the book as a reckoning with inherited identity, like we said, but you've said that choosing what to keep and what to release is both a challenge and a gift. What does that discernment look like to you in practice?
So the book takes its title from an essay in the book, Six to Carry the Casket and One to Say the Mass. And that's an essay about my relationship with my mom. I think that gives a good example of what that discernment looks like for me. She had a way with words. And for that essay, I returned to some of her greatest hits, some of the phrases, some of the quotes that live in our family memory most with great pride. and amusement. The Sheila-isms that stayed with me and are prominent. But I didn't want to just revisit the good stuff. I also needed to revisit, some funny and some tender moments, but I also needed to revisit the hard stuff. And it wasn't going to be useful just focusing on the positive stuff. I needed to be honest. I needed to be open to surprising or shocking or even hurting myself in diving back into some of these memories. And so when I leaned into the tough stuff with my mom in that essay, a lot of it was around her drinking and my parents' alcoholism. I wasn't able to make peace with that when she was alive. And so for me, that discernment gave me a chance to unpack the impact of their alcoholism on me. I was able to unpack not just its impact on me, but I started to have a lot more compassion for my parents, for my mom, and specifically. I think for a long time I wanted to forget or avoid the dark side of our relationship, but writing the essay and writing a lot of these essays helped me, embrace it more. I think the other part of the book that really speaks to this is the third part of the book, which is all about pride. And each essay celebrates or uplifts a place or a person or a piece of art or experience that I had that helped me shape my queer identity. And it wasn't just about celebrating them, it was about understanding what was the seed that was planted, sometimes 40 years ago or 20 years ago, by, this experience that came to benefit me later on. And so being able to not just celebrate it, but really hold on to those experiences, because I want them to keep shaping me. I want them to keep directing and guiding me, particularly if I feel like I'm straying from the person that I really want to become. Yeah. So I think, the discernment is all about honesty and about being open to, not just what I can remember, but being open to the other things that are going to come up too, making peace with all of it. That's been a really beautiful aspect of this book for me.
That's awesome. So you've used the word ornamental to describe your place in your family. That's a striking term. What did it mean for you to feel seen and not necessarily just known?
So I'm the youngest of 10, and and to anybody who is not from a big family, that sounds like an unmanageable chaos. But it's actually it's not. It's the first 9 were within 11 years of each other, and then there's a big gap, and I'm 7 years later. So I had a really different perspective. So I was both part of a big family and kind of an only child. So I had this kind of dual perspective. On the one hand, I was part of the big brood. On the other hand, I was at home alone with my parents for a big chunk of time. But by the time I was conscious, because of that big gap between number 9 and me, because of that gap, by the time I was conscious, the family culture was already set. There wasn't anything I could contribute as a 5-year-old or as a 10-year-old. So I just kind of had to go along with it. When it came to my siblings, yeah, I was peripheral. I think I was there. I think they know. I think they didn't dislike me, but I wouldn't say that they had any incentive to really reach out and get to know me. And so it had it had a lonely making effect, for me. That sense of being on the margins, always being peripheral. Sure, I was at the table, but if I ever spoke up or contributed to a conversation, they'd look at me like, where did he come from? Or there were moments where I got emotional because there was other stuff going on for me and nobody understood it, and they just kind of laughed me off. So to feel like you're part of the group but never really part of the group, it was a tough tension. And for me, the effect was really making me feel like my voice wasn't welcome. And that has an impact later in life too. I'm highly deferential, especially when I was working in schools. I was much more amenable to going with a flow instead of making a real bold choice. And I really looked at that as rooted in my relationship with my siblings. Yeah.
My next question was going to be, why do you think the youngest voice often gets overlooked? But I think you kind of just hit that out of the park with your explanation. So you write candidly about your parents' drinking and the emotional terrain it created. How did that shape your vulnerability and your sense of visibility?
That's a great question, and it's I think of my vulnerability as one of the things I really like about myself now. But I think as a kid, I was vulnerable. I was tentative about a lot of things in life. But living with my parents drinking also encouraged in me my interior life. I had an incentive to focus on thinking clearly, on unpacking my experiences, on making meaning out of things, because it was a way to kind of manage the tension and manage the difficulty of that. So I think that by encouraging that interior life, it made me really valuable. It made me really value my vulnerability. That I like being vulnerable. I like being sensitive. But at the same time, when I was 12 years old, that was dangerous. It was a pain point to be vulnerable in those spaces. And in terms of visibility, I had a really powerful experience when my several of my siblings were planning an intervention on my parents, on my mom specifically, because they were embarrassed by her drinking. And yet, nobody talked to me. I was the only one living at home at the time. I was the only one living with the alcoholism on a daily basis. And while I was coping with it in my own way, they were coping with it and not even seeing, hey, there's a kid at home. I saw them watch me get into a car with my parents when they were drunk and drive away, and nobody ever thought to say, hey, maybe somebody else should drive Bill home, or maybe we could give him an outlet. And I don't think that's unique to my family. I think any family that deals with addictions or any other sort of crisis, right, you lock down and you focus on what you're able to do. But I was just outside of their vision. I was invisible in that moment, that I wasn't even taken into consideration. And I could have told them everything they wanted to know. I could have told them how much she drank. I could have told them what she thought about all of them, because once she started drinking, she'd start talking about what she thought about all my siblings. So while I kept absorbing it from my parents, none of my siblings were seeing it. None of them were seeing me caught up in all of that. I think in the end, it did make me a stronger person. But it made me a stronger person because it made me a more compassionate person. It made me a more empathetic person. I think because I've known that kind of loneliness, I've known that kind of pain, that kind of unpredictability of life. And I think as a teacher, as a campus minister, and now in my work in ritual design, I think it makes me a lot more aware of the burdens that people bring and carry with them every day. And it's made me a better person because I've been able to tap into the good stuff. I tapped into what I took away from it, not necessarily I don't want to keep tapping into the painful stuff. I want to make peace with that and bring the compassion forward.
Right, I understand that. That's really beautiful, though, the way you transmuted that lack of consideration. And I do lament with you about that one, but I'm glad to hear that you did take the time to unpack the pain and use it to try to help the other people in this world, which is one of the big things I talk about on this podcast. So that's really important for those people who have experienced this, like Bill and I. Pay attention to the people around you, because this is a way for you to heal, is actually see other people that are not seen. So the final section of your book centers on queer identity. Why did you choose to place it there, and what does making Pride personal mean to you?
The book has 3 parts, and the first 2 parts, origins and tradition, I'm focusing on my personal relationships and experiences that were really formative for me, that shaped the person I have been, the person I am. The third part, I really focused on my queer identity, and it wasn't necessarily discrete experiences. It wasn't necessarily things with family. It wasn't necessarily things in school or at work. Instead, it was all these experiences, these places that I went, these movies and TV shows and books that gave me language to understand myself when the rest of the world didn't. I think a lot of queer people have this experience. And, for gay men in particular, we've got a long relationship with our divas, right? Like, why are we all obsessed with, these pop singers or actresses who are iconic for gay men? There's something about they were able to say something that we weren't able to say. They seemed to be experiencing, like Judy Garland seemed to be experiencing the pain that we were all feeling. Like she could feel her audience's pain and she could turn it into something beautiful on stage or on film. So so I wanted to uplift those experiences. But it wasn't just about celebrating them. It was also figuring out, like, what is Pride about? Why? And this really came out of my experience in 2019 and 2020. 2019 was the 50th anniversary of Stonewall, the riots that we think of as the kind of the fuse that exploded into the queer rights movement. in the late 20th century. And in 2020, it was the 50th anniversary of the first Pride Parade. And these were big markers to be able to celebrate where, how far we'd come. However, I walked into a mall one day that summer in 2019, and the mall was, covered in rainbows. All these stores, all these businesses trying to rainbow wash themselves and make themselves present as queer-friendly businesses. And you went to the parades that year, and it was corporate float after corporate float after corporate float with all the swag being thrown out to the crowd and all the big decorations. It felt like a marketing exercise. It didn't feel prideful. It didn't feel like a demonstration. It didn't feel like a community builder when you only saw the corporate stuff. So I wanted to make Pride personal for myself. I started setting time aside during the month of June, which is Pride Month, and I would just think about what's something that really impacted me and helped me understand myself as a gay person. And I would just, maybe that was an excuse to watch a couple clips on YouTube, or maybe it was an excuse to go back and read a book or flip through an old essay. But it was my way of making Pride personal. I wanted to keep considering, what are the things that shaped me and inspire me today and keep me wanting to move forward. I would love everybody to do that. I think that would be a great way to reclaim Pride. Especially in 2025, we saw how many corporate sponsorships pulled out of Pride very abruptly, and it was very revealing about who our friends are. So I think it leaves this opening too of, well, without corporate sponsorships, where's Pride going to go? Where are we as a community going to go? I think one way to go would be stepping into that very personal space, not thinking about the parties and the parades, but thinking about what were the experiences that each of us had that enabled us or that inhibited us in becoming who we are today, and can point a way forward. So that's what the whole third part of the book is about.
I agree with that. Do that deep introspecting, and the commercialization of Pride was something that really upset me as an ally, because it the basis of community and everything that it was, and how it was violently oppressed because people wanted to be able to find a space where they could be seen and they weren't hurting anyone and they weren't doing anything damaging. And then to see companies come forward and make it all about rainbows, and completely forget that there were people who were severely injured and lives lost in this. It's more than just a marketing tactics, a historical account, and it's a living history, because everyone that's a part of this community, whether they're an ally or they actually are LGBTQIA, they all matter, and they're all under that rainbow together because they were forced into a community by people pushing them to the sides. And if they forget that, then their enemies are going to be revealed to be very dangerous people. And I would hate to see the same kinds of things happen again.
Yeah.
So, definitely very important to keep our queer people safe in our country. So, you said that pop culture isn't fluff, it's formation. How did icons like Madonna or maybe the Golden Girls become spiritual texts in your life?
I love this question. Thank you for asking it. I think we do ourselves a disservice when we don't take culture seriously. It's something that every one of us can directly shape, in terms of how we engage music, TV, film, plays, social media, right? It's all these things that we can shape and that also shape us. So I think when we don't take pop culture seriously, we're doing ourselves a disservice. Pop culture, like TV shows like The Golden Girls, it gives us a chance to see some of the situations that we might have experienced in our own lives and see how it might play out differently, or see some of the challenges that we're thinking about. Every plot on the Golden Girls wasn't necessarily married to a particular narrative consistency about the girls. There's all sorts of, discrepant facts about each of the characters, and nobody can figure out how many children Blanche has. It's all over the place. But that wasn't the point. The point was, here's this group of people and how they might handle this situation that they find themselves facing. And some of it was really funny and some of it was super serious. But the Golden Girls were able to, in the late 80s and early 90s, lean into issues like women who are aging and maintaining careers and a sex life. Like, oh, that was a radical concept that women in their 50s could have careers and a sex life. But it was also about, the girls were confronting their own prejudices, their own assumptions, or their own pain spots. And there are some really moving episodes where queer audience members would have been able to see maybe not realistic depictions of queer people on screen, but at least they saw how the girls reacted. When a friend of Dorothy's shows up and is a lesbian, it's how does each of them respond? When Blanche's brother comes out and then comes back a couple seasons later with his partner and they talk about getting married, that in the late 80s, early 90s was pretty revolutionary to put that on television on prime time, and it forced a conversation for a lot of people. And for queer viewers, it was that little glimpse of finally we're being seen. Finally, like if the girls are paying attention to us, that's okay. So the girls provide not just a space to kind of, as a TV show, a space to work things out and to process ideas and experiences, but it also communicates comfort or urgency or joy to its audience members. And, everybody is able to walk away from it differently. You know, these texts kind of serve the same purpose in people's lives. Now, I'm not totally making it, putting the Golden Girls on par with ancient scripture. But in terms of how they shape our lives, in terms of how they're able to shape our worldview and give us space to work things out and understand how the world works, I think it serves that. And I take it very seriously. Madonna's another one. Since I first saw Madonna on the Open Your Heart video on Channel 44 in Chicago, after there was a music video hour that played after school. And for whatever reason, I think I must have been 10 years old, and I saw her on screen and I knew right away, that's my girl. And I've stuck with her ever since. Now, not just her personally, but her as a complex, as a whole kind of industry, right? All the artists and performers and stylists and producers and everybody who is fueled by her talent and pursues her vision. This kind of quote unquote Madonna, the complex. Madonna has changed the world, has moved the needle in global culture. I think that's interesting. I think that's interesting to pay attention to how one person with their whole team can change the way that we think about different media, change the way that we think about music, change the way that we can integrate different pieces of our lives and tell different stories. So Madonna and her work, I've got a personal interest, I have an academic interest, but any side of it is just coming down to understand, how are these people impacting not just our lives, but the entire world. And someone like Madonna has a huge reach and a huge impact. So it's worth paying attention to how is she presenting different possibilities for us to think about? How is she presenting people who have been marginalized? How is she sharing her platform, even getting out of the way and giving her stage over to people on the margins, and to be able to give them a microphone to be able to share their truths and communicate what's important to them?
That's beautifully said. So, what did queer spaces offer you that the rest of the world couldn't, and how do you see their role evolving for youth today?
I didn't know until I stepped into queer spaces how uncomfortable and uptight I was in the rest of the world. It wasn't until I went in, when I started, I was in college and I'd be able to get into clubs or get into bars. There's a place in Chicago called Berlin. It closed actually within the last couple of years, and it was this kind of legendary club, and it was named after Berlin, Germany of the 1920s, right? This kind of era of decadent and artistic explosion. So it was hearkening back to that. And that was also a time and a place where queer life was flourishing. And so walking into this club, the name of the club, the design on the walls, everything was kind of pointing to this historical thing. But then the people who were around me in that present, suddenly I recognized these are people like me. And I don't have to look over my shoulder. I don't have to keep guessing, like, am I saying the right thing? Am I lisping? Am I getting flirty and blushy when a cute boy walks by? I don't have to police myself in a queer space. And there's incredible freedom that comes with that. Unless you've experienced marginalization, I don't think you can understand how powerful that is. But I think it's true for women. I think it's true for people who have part of any other community or group that has been pushed to the margins. When you're in a space that is made for you, your shoulders drop. Your mind stops racing. You stop actively protecting yourself, and you can open yourself to new relationships and new ideas and new growth. And you can let the space provide a mirror to see yourself differently, to see new things inside of you. It's taken from some to be a mark of progress that we don't have as many like gay bars anymore, that the thing of a gayborhood, like a particular neighborhood in a city, they've sort of disappeared. It's not necessarily just the gays living in Boys Town in Chicago anymore. It's not just the gays living in the South End in Boston anymore. That's a sign of progress that, we're integrated, that, it's not, we don't need as many spaces. On the other hand, when the pendulum swings the other way, like we've seen in the last couple of years, now where are those spaces when we need them so badly? And I think about kids coming up today. They experience so much more freedom. There's much more visibility, and they can see themselves reflected in the popular culture. But they still need those spaces to go. They still need those places to be able to walk in and just not think about, who do I have to pretend to be? I just want to be myself. Who do I have to look over my shoulder? Do I have to be worried about who's going to be coming in? Who's going to see me here? Those questions evaporate. Those fears evaporate when you walk into a queer space. So for me personally, and I think for a lot of queer people, especially right now, it's incredibly valuable.
I agree with that. Switching gears just a little bit, you taught religion in Catholic schools while living as a gay man. That's a bold intersection. What made the role so precarious and what kept you in it?
I started teaching and working as a campus minister right out of grad school. And I had a really positive experience of religion growing up, and I never experienced the conflict that a lot of people have. Sometimes you get messaging that, from your religious community, that, your sexual identity is wrong or aberrant or whatever. I didn't get those messages. We didn't talk about it. It wasn't a topic of conversation, but I didn't get the stuff that was so negative that I would internalize and really struggle with. So I had a really positive experience of religion, and I was fascinated with church. I was involved in communities and retreats and liturgy and service. And I grew up in a family where Catholicism was very important to my parents. They went to mass every day, but they were not strict and pious. They were pretty progressive. For them, religion wasn't just about piety and prayer. It was about social justice. It was about care for creation. It was about ethical discernment and living a life of service. That's what Catholicism looked like to me. So when I started teaching in Catholic schools, I wasn't pretending to be anything else. It was, I wanted to continue to give life to this experience of Catholicism, and I wanted to provide that to my students. The precarious part is that in Catholic schools and in Catholic institutions in general, if you are not living in accordance with the teaching of the Catholic Church, you're either not supposed to be hired or you're supposed to be fired. And there are a lot of queer teachers in Catholic schools. And it was never a question because they were good teachers, because the school communities would see them they saw us as valuable teachers, not, oh, this is somebody we have to eject because of their one piece of their identity. But there was that implicit message of like, you can't really talk about it. You can't really slip up and let other people to see about it. If a parent who didn't like the fact that I was gay wanted to complain, it wasn't just about complaining to the school. They could complain to the diocese. The diocese would report to the Vatican. The Vatican would go to the religious order that runs the school, and then the religious order was expected to come down on the school. This has happened lots of times, and particularly after equal marriage happened and marriage and your sexual orientation was suddenly a matter of public record, you started to see a lot of people being fired from Catholic schools and hospitals and other institutions because suddenly their sexual orientation was a matter of record, and they were fired. So I walked into school every day with this on my shoulders, not just that, like, oh no, if I say the wrong thing or if a parent decides they don't like me, they could cause trouble not just for me, but for the entire school community or even the whole order that was sponsoring the school. Yeah, precarious is an interesting word. It wasn't until I saw Dan Savage speak at a conference in 2012. And up to this point, I thought I was committed to Catholic education. I was working in Catholic schools, even as a gay campus minister, as a gay teacher. I was giving them a different perspective, a different face for the church, maybe. But Dan Savage talked about the It Gets Better project at this conference, and the room was packed, all these people who wanted to learn about the project. And somebody got up and asked a question and said, Dan, they were reading the question for somebody else who couldn't actually stand up and even ask a question in that environment without getting fired. And Dan listened to her ask, well, I'm a queer teacher in a conservative religious school. What advice would you give to someone like me? And he said, you're not going to like my answer. He said, my advice is to get your resume in order because you think you're providing a role model or you're providing a safe space for those kids. But what you're really communicating to them is that it's okay to leave part of yourself at the door on the way into work in the morning. And immediately, my entire self-understanding as a teacher, as an educator, as a Catholic was just turned upside down. And that started for me the path to leave Catholic schools. And it was incredibly painful, and but it was also incredibly liberating to, when I started working at an Episcopal school, the first thing I could do was put up a safe space poster in my office. I couldn't do that at a Catholic school without inviting, without it being a lightning rod. So leaving that space, it wasn't just about what I was communicating to students. It also gave me more freedom to be myself as a professional, as a person, as a person. Yeah. So it was precarious and it was exhausting. I didn't realize how exhausting that was for me until I actually left Catholic schools.
What shifted in you after you heard that statement by Dan Savage? Was it like just immediate visceral realization?
I suddenly felt deep shame. I thought I was communicating to my students something very different. Um, and I felt deep shame that I didn't recognize that irony, that conflict. The implicit message was, I've left something at the door. That's okay. I can survive without that. It's okay. It's not okay. It's really not okay to expect people to leave some part of themselves at the door, on the way in. I also felt in that moment complicit with an unjust institution in a way that I hadn't been able to see before. I know the church has complications. I've always known the church has a history of unjust actions. I didn't see myself as complicit in that injustice. And in that moment, I really saw myself differently. And I felt deep shame.
Well, that's heavy. In your spiritual framework, you say the primacy of conscience trumps everything else. That's a radical claim in Catholic circles. What does it mean to you and how do you live it?
This was a really important piece for my parents. When I described my parents as more progressive, justice-oriented Catholics, primacy of conscience was very important to my mom. I think of it as like civil disobedience. It's kind of a Catholic version of civil disobedience. The idea is that my conscience is the part of me that is closest to God. And so when my conscience tells me that something is right or wrong, especially if it conflicts with the norms or authorities or even the Pope himself. My mom used to say, oh, what does the Pope know? He's just another priest. So she had a very flattened view of the hierarchy of the church. But the conscience was the thing that I was taught to listen to. And for me, that was part of why I didn't feel the conflict between my sexual orientation and my religious identity. I thought, well, this is the way that I have been created. This is how God made me. The rest of the church doesn't recognize this yet, but maybe they'll catch up and maybe they'll come around and see. So for me, it wasn't just, it's not just a theological loophole. It is also a call to pay very close attention, to listen very closely to my conscience, to make sure that my conscience isn't getting trampled by other distractions or other prejudices or desires so for me the primacy of conscience is that piece of Catholic theology that I think is not uplifted enough, particularly for Catholics. It's not just about following the rules and following old traditions. Sometimes it means adapting those traditions. Sometimes it means giving new life to those traditions so that we can see the world, so that we can see creation more fully, more wholly, and engage in it with our full selves.
You've written about women religious as archetypes of safe space within the church. What have you witnessed in their leadership, and how do they model inclusion in ways the hierarchy resists?
I wrote an essay about nuns and specifically and this was not in the first two parts of my book, this was in the pride section of the book. And that surprised a lot of people. That has surprised a lot of people that nuns made it into my list of the people the experiences that I had that gave me language to understand myself. My aunt is a Benedictine nun. She was prioress of her order, of her monastery for a period of time. I had a great aunt who was a sister of charity. I grew up around nuns. It was part of the fabric of our lives to be The nuns at our grade school were wonderful. The Cincinnati Dominicans, they devoted their entire lives to their students. They just would leave home and devote their entire lives, their entire energy to us. And that was always so remarkable to me. But one of the things I remember about visiting my aunt's community, in particular, the Benedictine monastery in Chicago, that was my first example of a chosen family. And I didn't have that language for it, at 5 years old. But later in life, in my 30s, I think I was particularly aware of how much the nuns were their choice to live in community in this way is a very formalized chosen family, and it's a powerful experience to think about. Here are these people who have chosen to live their lives together because they share these convictions, because they share these passions. I think that's really beautiful. But more so, I worked in schools that were run by women's orders, and it was really clear to me that the women religious were the ones who were keeping the church going when the bishops and the priests and the popes were all concerned about the kind of maybe bigger, more frivolous things. The nuns were doing the work on the ground, educating and working in hospitals and social justice ministries. And they've also been, by and large, incredibly inclusive and supportive around LGBTQ folks. Every time there's a question in the church about queer people and their relationship with the church, the nuns are the ones who are the first to speak up for queer people. The nuns are the ones who are the first to get on social media and say, this is a matter of justice. This is right. We want to protect our queer brothers and sisters. So it's not just the fact of women religious living in community that I think is interesting and beautiful, but it's also that community experience enables them and propels them to speak out with great conviction, with great authority, because of their own moral discernment, their own demonstration of living a life of faith and justice. So I continue to look to the nuns as the example to follow.
That's pretty inspirational and beautiful. You describe reflection as a radical act in a culture obsessed with speed and performance. What does it mean to pause, to meditate, to ritualize your own becoming?
I love reflecting. Reflecting isn't just kind of sitting back and opining, or it's not a warm and fuzzy thing. Reflection is a systematic exercise. Reflection is best done. And in this, I'm really inspired by John Dewey, the American philosopher. His definition of reflection is so important. Reflection is a systematic process. It's rooted in the sciences. It's rooted in the scientific method. It's best when it's done in relationship or in interaction with others. It requires attitudes of openness and attitudes that are going to be open to new ideas and to changing and transforming. So reflection as a critical practice has always been really important to me. I think of it as, this is my way to rewire my brain. I can take time to sit and I can focus on something, or I can just focus on nothing and let everything relax, everything settle just for a few moments. And that helps me see the world clearly. It helps me see what's in front of me, see the rest of my day a little bit more clearly. I did a lot of different types of meditation, different types of reflection and contemplation exercises. And during the pandemic, I started offering guided meditations on Zoom based on my own meditation method that I developed as a teacher or as a campus minister. And it's a blend of different contemplative exercises. But in 2020 and 2021 especially, I was seeing friends and strangers just pulling their hair out. They didn't know what to do. We were all forced to sit still. We were all trapped at home. What do we do with that? So the one thing I could offer, I can make space to offer a guided meditation, at least a little bit of practice at being present, a little bit of practice of peace and quiet amidst all the chaos, amidst all that. I continue those meditations. I still offer them on Tuesdays, and sometimes I get 2 people, sometimes I get 10. It's just an open door for anybody who needs a little bit of peace and quiet. And it's hard to step away. It's hard to step away from the busyness. It's hard to step away from the freneticism of the world, but it's worth it because it gives us time to reset. It gives us time to make space, whether it's for prayer or just for a little bit of sanity. It's one of those tools that we can use. It's totally in our hands. If we have 5 seconds alone, we can have 5 seconds to reflect and to find ourselves grounded. But I don't think it's never a bad thing to stop and sit still. And that's one of the things that I've learned from my own practice.
Yep, introspection is one of my favorite words to use on this podcast. So, why this book and why now? Who were you writing it for, and what do you hope readers carry with them after closing the last page?
I didn't set out to write a book. I really started writing to understand how I landed where I landed, and I wanted to understand how we all landed in 2020, and to figure out how to move forward. I was sharing these essays in earlier forms on my blog and in my newsletter, and friends and strangers had reached out. I hope you're turning this into a book. Like, oh, no, 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 I couldn't do that. And then three friends in particular told me that I should think about writing a book. And I thought, okay, well, maybe. I had a hard time believing that anybody would be interested in reading these essays, and strangers, because it's I don't live I don't have an interesting enough life to deserve a memoir. I don't expect anybody to be paying attention to my life, but I I do have tools that I want to share. I think it's worth the time to stop and understand, what made me who I am, and what do I want to hold on to, and what do I want to let go of, so I can continue to grow into the person that I want to be. That sounds like a really daunting task for people, but I find, when I've got tools of reflection at my fingertips, it's a lot easier. I wanted to demonstrate that it's not just worth the time, but it's also doable. It's easy to do, to stop and honor your past, and think about how that has prepared you for this moment, and how it can take us moving forward. So, in terms of who I was writing for, anybody who's looking to make meaning, anybody who's looking to figure out, we've all experienced 2020 and beyond. What do we do with all those experiences? With the pandemic, with the social reckoning, with political tribalism, with economic crisis after economic crisis. What are we doing with these experiences? And I hope people who are also struggling with that question would be able to read this book and think, okay, I've got some tools to bring forward too. Here's the world that I want to live in, and here's how we're going to make it.
That was beautifully said. Bill, thank you for joining me today on the Mind of Cy Marie. Six to carry the casket and one to say the Mass is obviously more than a memoir. It's a ritual of reflection, a queer catechism, and a call to conscious belonging. To everyone listening, the book is available now. Do you want to go ahead and tell our listeners where they could get your book at?
Absolutely. All the information is on my website, billhulsman.com. You can find Six to Carry the Casket and One to Say the Mass on bookshop.org, through your local independent bookstore, or Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Allstora, anywhere else you buy books. But all
Awesome.
those links are also available on my website.
Awesome. I will also have a link in the description notes to his website so that everyone can go over there and check it out. It sounds like an awesome book. And also, to everyone listening, read it with reverence, laugh when it hurts, and let it guide you toward the identity you choose, not the one that you inherited. Until next time, stay sovereign, stay sacred, and keep writing truth that only you can live.